I think one of the things I'm really excited about is a very recent thing in that it's come to market really recently. It's been in the works for about 5 years, and it's something called a liquid biopsy. And the reason this is interesting is that when you think about the sort of major chronic diseases, which is the diseases of atherosclerosis, so heart disease, stroke, cancer, and Alzheimer's disease, we don't have a lot of great tools at detecting cancer early. So cancer screening is a somewhat controversial topic. Most people are probably familiar with things like mammograms, colonoscopies, and PSA testing. There are 2 or 3 others that rise to the level of having evidence to suggest that we do them, for example, pap smears. But when it comes to some of the really bad actors of cancer, we don't really have great screening tools. And so what a liquid biopsy does is it draws a sample of blood, and through that tries to predict whether or not you have cancer cells in your body, and tries to do so, of course, when you have very, very few of them, because the evidence is overwhelming that, all things being equal, a cancer, when caught early, at an early stage, is imminently more curable than a cancer caught at a later stage. And probably the most compelling explanation for that is that the longer a cancer gets to fester in your body, the more chance it has to develop mutations. And the more mutations it generates, the more difficult it is to target later on. So there are a number of companies that have been doing this, but to me, the most interesting by far is a company called Grail, because of the method that they've gone about doing this. And the method is using something called cell-free DNA, as opposed to tumor DNA. As a little side note, Grail was recently acquired by another company called Illumina, Illumina being the largest company that does DNA sequencing. And a very interesting note is the FTC has sued Illumina for antitrust violations in this acquisition, which, if you understand the science of it, and we don't have to get into it in great detail, is literally the dumbest thing I've ever heard. So that the FTC has done this, in my opinion, is actually a tragedy, because it is actually going to cost lives. It's going to cost tens of thousands of lives in delay if this acquisition does not go through, because Illumina has the power to scale this up like no other company would. Putting that aside for a moment, what is cell-free DNA? Because that's really at the heart of this. What is cell-free DNA?
Cell-free
like DNA.
CELL hyphen free.
Yeah, as in DNA that's not in a cell. So most of the DNA in your body is contained within cells. But when a cell breaks down, or sometimes even when cells spontaneously, like red blood cells, or actually typically monocytes, white blood cells, make DNA and then spontaneously release it from them, you can capture these small amounts of cell-free DNA. So if you draw somebody's blood, whether or not they have cancer or not, they're going to have a certain amount of this cell-free DNA floating around. You have signatures on DNA called methylations. A methyl group is just a carbon with 3 hydrogens on it. It's one of the most basic building blocks of organic chemistry. And as DNA acquires these signatures, so remember, DNA is made up of these 4 nucleotides. When they start binding these little methyl groups—
That's the ACTG.
Exactly, ACTG. As they start acquiring these methyl groups, that tells a bit of a story. And even though there's not a lot of cell-free DNA, when you look at it, the best analogy, and one of my analysts actually came up with this analogy, is it's sort of like looking at, meteor fragments that would land in the desert and being able to understand what type of an asteroid they came from. So even though the asteroid is enormous and it shed like big chunks of meteor down to Earth, and by the time they actually hit the Earth, they're just small rocks, a chemical analysis of that would give you a greater idea where it came from. So this type of test can actually detect up to 50 different types of cancers. There are certain ones that it's not very good at detecting, such as prostate cancer, which is not bad because we have other tools that are so good at detecting prostate cancer. But when you do this blood test, you basically get a readout which says no cancer detected, or the following have been detected. And it does this with about a 50% sensitivity and about a 97 to 99% specificity. Now, to explain what that means in context requires a little bit of math, and it's worth going into. So sensitivity is the probability that a cancer is truly there if detected by the test. And specificity is the probability that the cancer is not there if not detected by the test. So sensitivity speaks to true positives, and specificity speaks to true negatives. Now, at first, 50% sensitivity doesn't sound that good, but you have to remember it depends on what we call the pretest probability is. So pretest probability says, what is the probability that you have cancer before I test you? And that's a function of many things. It's a function of the prevalence of that cancer. It's a function of your age. It's a function of other behaviors. So for example, two people being otherwise identical, except one being a smoker and one not being a smoker, are going to have very different pretest probabilities. But when you start to think about, for example, what's your pretest probability of having pancreatic cancer? It's quite low, fortunately, even though pancreatic cancer is one of the most lethal cancers out there. So in a low probability environment, a modest sensitivity of 50% and a very high specificity produces incredible, what we call positive and negative predictive value. So what do those things mean? So positive predictive value, as it sounds, means what's the probability that if you get a positive test, you truly have cancer? A negative predictive value is, of course, if you have a negative test, what's the probability it's negative? These numbers end up being well north of 90%. In fact, the negative predictive value is about 99.7%. The positive predictive value is in the ballpark of about 97%. So these are really exciting tests, especially when you pair them with some of the other things that we do in our practice, such as relying on a very special type of MRI technology that uses something called diffusion-weighted imaging that adds sort of a functional dimension to MRI. ROG, MRI, it'll pop up. And yes, that's an episode we usually make our patients listen to before they go and get one of those MRIs so they understand it. I think the major insight, and I will be doing a podcast on this, but I need to wait until this FTC issue is resolved a little bit, because the person that I really want to interview for the podcast, who is one of the people that had the biggest hand in developing this, is actually now the chief scientific officer at Illumina. And so for him to be able to speak about it, obviously it would need to make sense that Illumina actually owns the technology again. I would say, and this might change as I get deeper into understanding their journey, I think it was the realization that tumor DNA was not the place to go. So at the outset of this process, people didn't know what to look for. Would you look for RNA of tumors? Because RNA is it's the template that's telling you to make the protein. And that didn't really pan out because RNA is so unstable by itself. So then pivoting to DNA, the logical choice was, well, let's look for the tumor DNA. If you have pancreatic cancer and we can find the DNA of a pancreatic cancer cell, that would be a good place to start. But you have to be looking for cell-free DNA by definition when you're doing a liquid biopsy, because you're not going to sample the organ. And it turns out that tumor DNA represents about 0.1% of cell-free DNA. So I think the big aha for Grail was realizing, no, let's look at cell-free DNA, which is much more abundant, but instead look at the methylation patterns and then specifically figure out what those methylation patterns were. So that was the real puzzle. I have been waiting for this, like I said, for 5 years, because I think that I'm just less bullish on the idea that we're going to quote unquote cure cancer, right? If you put cancer in perspective, the overall survival for people with metastatic cancer has improved about 5% in 50 years. And virtually all of that improvement has come with a handful of very specific types of cancers. So for example, something called the GI stromal tumor, and a certain type of testicular cancer for which there's been very specific behaviors of these that have rendered them quite sensitive to certain chemotherapies. But when it comes to, lung cancer, when it comes to pancreatic cancer, when it comes to colon cancer, breast cancer, once you don't catch it early, you're sort of in the same situation you were in about 1970. And that's pretty depressing when you consider how much progress has been made in cardiovascular disease since that time. So I think the answer in how do you live longer with respect to cancer is prevention first. It's both, right? So what can we do to prevent cancer? And not smoking and being metabolically healthy are hands down the two biggest things that you can do. And then the next step is how aggressively can you screen and stack different levels of screening technologies on top of each other, so that, the way we kind of describe it to patients is you want to think of like the Swiss cheese approach, right? You want to be able to stack a whole bunch of things on top of themselves so that you just get only one pencil can fit through.